In my presentation, I will be discussing one of my favorite Indigenous visual artists, Susan Point. Susan Point is a Musqueam artist focused on bringing attention to the rich history of Coast Salish style artwork through dynamic and unique takes on traditional Indigenous pieces. Susan was born out of Alert Bay, British Columbia, and grew up on the Musqueam Reserve. Susan is one of the pioneers for researching and repopularizing Coast Salish style artwork. Coast Salish tribes belong to a group of ethnically and linguistically related indigenous peoples out of the Pacific Northwest coast. Susan has lived on the Musqueam First Nation reservation in Vancouver her whole life and proudly tries to express their rich history through her work. Susan started her art career in 1981 when at the time most indigenous pieces were commonly representative of more northern native groups. Despite this, she chose to be unique and began creating art through bracelets, pendants, and other jewelry that were symbolic of her own native tribe's culture. Point's artwork often incorporates themes related to traditional Coast Salish work associated with women. These themes include symbols used in Salish style weaving and designs carved on traditional women's utensils, such as the spindle whorl. Susan recalls being first intrigued by this form of craftsmanship when she came across an elaborately carved piece of wood called a spindle whorl. This spindle created massive inspiration for many pieces in her career, with her current solo exhibition even being titled The Spindle Whorl. In a recent interview for NGC magazine on her exhibition, they asked Susan why the spindle whorl features so prominently in her work. She stated that the circle represents many things to her, such as the circle of life, the moon, the ripples you see in the pond, salmon eggs, and much more. Susan says the symbol means harmony and triggers inspiration for her and her ancestors. Her art style, from the beginning of her career, from jewelry to canvas to large sculptures, seemed to consciously evolve, and as she tried to find her own space in the art world, Susan would go on to push the boundaries of Indigenous artwork. First experimenting with blending of traditional colors to the use of non-traditional materials, her brashness and unique take on how Coast Salish style could be was originally met with negative responses and deemed non-traditional. Thankfully, however, she prevailed past the negativity and went on to explore other techniques and a broad range of materials, including work with glass, resin, concrete, wood, paper, and even steel casting. Susan uses various techniques in her work that are unique to traditional Coast Salish style artwork. For instance, she often uses the number 4 as it has great significance to many First Nations. This can be seen in one of her first popular pieces, Salmon. The number 4 in Indigenous culture represents many things, such as the four peoples, the four winds, the four elements, and so on. Susan likes to give subtle nods to her own tribe through her work, often using materials such as yellow cedar. This particular type of cedar is very common on the Musqueam Reservation in the Pacific Northwest coast. You can see the use of yellow cedar bark in her famous mural titled The Circle Within. The yellow cedar in this piece creates a vibrant focal point as well honors the significance of the color and its extremely significant place in Indigenous culture. The use of the material is not only important for the visual aspect, but holds great significance to Canadian Indigenous history, as the cedar was commonly used for anti-inflammatory properties, to dress wounds, and even used to ward off evil. It is clear Susan is very thoughtful when it comes to the material she uses, as the physical work itself that you can touch and feel seems to be just as important as what the visual image is trying to portray. Susan is now one of the most acclaimed Indigenous Canadian artists as she has created many large-scale pieces, even those seen in the Vancouver International Airport, uh, and now a new piece presented in the Smithsonian Institute of Washington titled The Beaver and the Mink. This piece was a gift from the Government of Canada to celebrate the opening of their National Museum of the American Indian and share a piece of our own Indigenous history. Her importance to the Canadian Indigenous art world cannot be understated, as she has created many pieces representative of the significant materials held dearly by Indigenous peoples, and has also created a massive global recognition to not only Coast Salish style artwork, but Indigenous Canadian history as well. Thank you for listening.